For years, a team of scientists traveled to the farthest corners of our planet with one strange goal in mind: collect blood and tissue samples from as many different human populations as possible. They went to remote villages hidden deep inside the Amazon jungle. They visited nomadic herders wandering across the open plains of Mongolia. They reached tiny islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean, and they climbed into small mountain communities tucked away in the Himalayas. One sample at a time, they built something the world had never seen before: the largest collection of human genetic information ever assembled. Millions upon millions of genetic markers, stored and compared, all leading toward one single question that people have argued about for hundreds of years. What actually makes us different from each other? When the final results came in, they did not just answer the question. They completely destroyed almost everything people believed about race, ancestry, and human identity. Some of the researchers looked at their first results and thought their machines were broken. The patterns didn't match anything they expected. Populations that were supposed to be closely related showed almost no connection. Populations that were supposed to be completely separate turned out to be surprisingly close. Scientific journals around the world rushed to publish the findings. If you enjoy learning about discoveries like this, stick around, because this channel breaks down incredible science stories just like this one every single week. Now let's get into what the data actually showed. This massive research effort started back in the early 1990s. The idea was simple but controversial. Gather DNA from native populations around the globe before modern life, and mixing made that information harder to find. Some people criticized the project, saying it felt intrusive. Others defended it, saying the knowledge gained would be priceless. But almost everyone involved agreed on one thing: whatever the results showed, they would change the way we understood human beings forever. Researchers pulled genetic material from over 1,000 people, representing more than 50 separate population groups spread across 7 major regions of the world: Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, East Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas. Each sample went through powerful sequencing machines capable of reading enormous stretches of genetic code in a short amount of time. The information piled up fast. Entire data centers filled with nothing but raw genetic material, waiting to be studied and compared. The moment researchers started comparing the numbers, something jumped out immediately. The genetic gap between what we call different races was far smaller than anybody expected. Picture someone born in Tokyo standing next to someone born in Norway. Their skin might look completely different. Their hair, their facial structure, even the shape of their eyes might look nothing alike. But if you looked inside their cells, at the actual genetic code that builds a human being, they were more than 99.9% identical. That tiny leftover fraction, less than 1%, is where the real story was hiding. As scientists dug deeper into that small percentage, they discovered that our traditional idea of race barely holds up at all once you look at actual genetics. In some cases, a person from one part of East Africa shared more genetic similarities with someone from Southern Europe than they did with another person from West Africa, even though both were labeled the same race. Native groups living deep in the Amazon carried unexpected genetic traits, also found in populations from Papua New Guinea, thousands of miles away. The tidy racial boxes humans invented simply do not exist inside our actual DNA. But the biggest surprise was still coming. Researchers discovered that the highest level of genetic diversity anywhere on Earth is found within the African continent itself, not between continents, not between what we typically label as separate races, within Africa alone. 2 people born in neighboring villages in Ethiopia could be more genetically different from one another than a random person from Ethiopia is from a random person in Sweden. Once you understand the history of human migration, this makes complete sense. Modern humans first appeared in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For the vast majority of our species' existence, our ancestors stayed right there. Populations split apart, merged back together, adapted to dozens of different environments, and slowly built up an enormous amount of genetic variety over hundreds of thousands of years. Every bit of genetic diversity found across the rest of the entire world today is essentially just a small piece of the diversity that already existed inside Africa long before anyone ever left. When small groups of early humans finally began migrating outward, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, they only carried a portion of that original genetic variety with them. Scientists call this the founder effect. A small group leaving their homeland can never carry the full genetic range of the population they came from. They're only a sample, and that limited sample becomes the genetic foundation for every population that eventually spreads out from them. Here's an easy way to picture it. Imagine a bag holding 100 different colored marbles, representing the full genetic diversity found in Africa. Now reach in and randomly grab just 15 of those marbles, placing them into a brand new bag. That second bag represents the genetic diversity that traveled outside of Africa. Even if those 15 marbles eventually get split apart and scattered across Europe and Asia, they can never contain more variety than what remained in that original bag of 100. This exact pattern showed up over and over again as researchers traced different migration paths across the planet. The farther a population traveled from Africa, the less genetic diversity it carried. European populations showed less variation than populations from the Middle East. East Asian groups showed less variation than Central Asian groups. And Native American populations, who traveled the farthest distance and crossed over the Bering Land Bridge in one of the very last major human migrations, ended up with the least genetic diversity of any group studied. But diversity wasn't the only shocking piece of this puzzle. When researchers zoomed in on specific genes, they found something almost unbelievable. The genes responsible for the physical features we typically use to sort people into races, skin tone, hair texture, and facial shape, make up less than 1/10 of 1% of our entire genetic code. Think about that for a moment. The traits humans have used for centuries to justify discrimination, slavery, and violence against one another represent an almost invisible fraction of what actually makes us human, genetically speaking. And these traits are surprisingly new in the timeline of human history. The genetic mutation responsible for lighter skin tones in European populations only appeared around 8,000 years ago. Blue eyes are even more recent, showing up somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, tracing back to a single ancestor near the Black Sea region. East Asian populations developed their distinct eye shape through a completely separate genetic path, unrelated to anything happening in Europe. These visible differences that people have obsessed over for generations are incredibly recent evolutionary changes. On the timeline of our species as a whole, they happened in the blink of an eye. Meanwhile, the traits we cannot see with our eyes carry far more complexity. Things like how our bodies fight off disease, how efficiently we process food, how our brains develop, and how strong our immune systems are. These invisible traits show massive variation inside every single population group on Earth. You simply cannot look at someone's face and predict their intelligence, their physical ability, or their future health risks. The genes controlling those traits are scattered randomly across all human populations, with no connection to skin color whatsoever. The research also challenged a lot of common beliefs people hold about ancestry. Most people alive today actually carry genetic ancestry from several different geographic regions, whether they realize it or not. Someone who identifies as fully Chinese might carry genetic markers connected to Central Asia. Someone who identifies as European might carry traces of Middle Eastern ancestry. Someone from the Caribbean islands almost certainly carries a genetic mix of African, European, and indigenous American ancestry, all blended together. And this genetic blending is not some new phenomenon caused by modern travel and globalization. It has been happening for as long as human populations have come into contact with one another throughout history. Studies using ancient DNA revealed that people living in Europe today actually descend from at least 3 separate ancestral groups: early farming communities, the original hunter-gatherers who lived there long before farming existed, and herding populations that migrated in from the steppes of Eastern Europe and Asia. None of these groups were pure or isolated. Each one was already a blend of even earlier populations before they ever combined. This same pattern shows up everywhere researchers looked. East Asian populations carry genetic traces from multiple separate waves of migration. Pacific Island populations trace back to at least 2 distinct waves of settlers, mixing seafaring groups from Southeast Asia with earlier native island populations. Even populations that seem completely isolated on the surface show clear evidence of genetic mixing with neighboring groups stretching back thousands of years. The data completely destroys the idea of racial purity. There has never been a single pure race, and there has never been a truly isolated population that avoided mixing with others, given enough time. The idea that you can draw a clean genetic line separating one race from another simply falls apart the moment you actually study the genome. So if race has no real genetic foundation, why do humans look so visibly different from one another around the world? The answer comes down to adaptation. As early humans spread out across the globe, they encountered wildly different environments, different climate zones, different elevations, different levels of sunlight, and different disease risks. Natural selection favored whatever traits helped a population survive best in its specific environment. Darker skin offered protection against intense sunlight near the equator. Lighter skin allowed better vitamin D production in regions farther north, where sunlight is weaker. The distinct eye shape found in East Asian populations may have helped protect eyes from cold wind and bright snow glare in certain climates. These adaptations often developed independently in completely separate populations, facing similar environmental challenges, something scientists call convergent evolution. For example, populations in southern India and Aboriginal populations in Australia both developed dark skin, despite having no close genetic connection and living on opposite sides of the world. Their skin color evolved separately because both groups lived under intense sun exposure. The specific genetic mutations behind their dark skin are actually different from one another. 2 separate populations arrived at a similar physical outcome through 2 completely different genetic paths. This is the same reason dolphins and sharks both developed streamlined, similar-looking bodies, even though one is a mammal and the other is a fish. Similar environmental pressure can push very different organisms towards similar physical solutions. This pattern becomes even more interesting when you look at traits that don't follow neat geographic lines. The ability to digest milk into adulthood shows up in populations with a long history of raising dairy animals, parts of Northern Europe, certain East African herding communities, and some groups in Central Asia. But that same trait is largely absent in most East Asian populations and many African populations, even ones located fairly close to groups that do carry it. This trait spread based on cultural practices tied to farming animals, not based on any racial category. High-altitude adaptation tells a similar story. Populations living in Tibet developed genetic changes allowing their bodies to use oxygen more efficiently at extreme elevation. Populations living in the Andes Mountains of South America developed a completely different set of genetic adaptations to achieve a similar result. Both groups can survive comfortably at altitudes that would cause serious health issues for people from lower elevations, but they arrived there through entirely separate genetic solutions, shaped by adapting independently to similar environmental demands. There was one more major discovery buried in the data, something researchers took time to fully understand. Certain disease-related genetic traits really do appear more frequently in specific populations. Sickle cell disease shows up more often in people with West African ancestry. Tay-Sachs disease appears more frequently among people of Ashkenazi Jewish background. Cystic fibrosis affects people of European descent at higher rates than other groups. At first glance, this seemed to support the old idea that race carries real biological meaning. But a closer look told a very different story. These genetic patterns did not spread because of race. They spread because they offered a survival advantage against very specific, local threats. The sickle cell trait offers real protection against malaria, a disease that was extremely common in parts of West Africa. Carrying just one copy of the gene gave people resistance to malaria without causing the full disease. Natural selection favored that trait heavily in regions where malaria posed a constant danger, no matter what racial label we might assign to the people living there. The same explanation applies to other disease patterns tied to geography. They are not proof of deep genetic separation between races. They are proof of populations adapting to local, specific environmental threats over time. A person from West Africa and a person from a historically malaria-heavy region of Southern Europe might both carry malaria-resistant genes, despite being labeled as different races. Meanwhile, two people classified under the same racial category could carry very different disease risks if their ancestors came from regions facing completely different environmental pressures. This genetic evidence directly challenges the outdated medical habit of using race as a stand-in for genetic risk. A doctor who assumes every patient from a certain racial background shares identical genetic health risks is making an assumption that science simply does not support. Individual genetic testing gives a far more accurate picture of a person's health risks than any racial category ever could. So where did the idea of separate human races even come from in the first place? The concept took shape during the 1700s and 1800s when European scientists of that era tried to sort human beings into categories the same way they sorted plants and animals. They built rigid hierarchies based on physical appearance and cultural customs. They ranked entire groups of people as superior or inferior. And tragically, these false classifications were used to justify colonization, slavery, and horrific violence around the world. These early scientists claimed they were following pure objective observation. But in reality, their conclusions were shaped heavily by the biases and power systems of their time. They saw differences in technology or social structure between populations and wrongly credited those differences to inborn biological superiority rather than recognizing them as the result of history, environment, and circumstance. They took temporary cultural and historical differences and turned them into permanent, fixed genetic categories. Modern genetics has completely dismantled that old way of thinking. The very traits early scientists used to build racial hierarchies show absolutely no connection to intelligence, morality, or human worth. The small genetic differences that truly do exist between populations are either neutral or simply useful adaptations to local environments. None of it supports ranking any group as superior or inferior to another. But maybe the most powerful part of this entire discovery isn't what scientists found. It's what they didn't find. They found no genetic support for national borders, no genetic backing for racial nationalism, no evidence that any single population is more advanced or more fully human than any other. What they found instead was one single species, sharing a surprisingly recent common origin, and a genetic history that makes our surface-level differences feel incredibly small in the bigger picture. The data revealed something remarkable. The average person alive today shares a common ancestor with every other human being on Earth from roughly 3,000 years ago. That means if you trace your family tree back only about 120 generations, you'll find someone who is directly related to literally every single person alive today. Your family history and the family history of someone living on the opposite side of the planet meet at a single point in the surprisingly recent past. Go back even further, to around 7,000 years ago, and something even stranger appears. Every single person alive today shares the exact same complete set of ancestors from that time period. Anyone alive back then who has any living descendants today is, by definition, an ancestor of every one of the roughly 8 billion people currently on Earth. Farmers living in ancient Mesopotamia, communities along the Yellow River, hunter-gatherers scattered through southern Africa. If any of them have surviving descendants today, that means you are one of them, and so is every other person alive right now. This discovery completely erases the idea of a single, pure ancestral bloodline. Nobody descends from just one ancient group. Every person alive descends from all of them at once. Your ancestry is not a straight line pointing back to one single starting point. It's an enormous, tangled web connecting the entire human family together. Whatever ancestral group a person feels most connected to comes down to culture and personal identity, not something written into their DNA. The genetic data also uncovered unexpected connections between populations separated by massive distances. Some Native American populations carry genetic markers connected to Siberian populations, confirming ancient migration paths across the Bering Land Bridge, but they also carry faint traces of ancient genetic material linked to populations from Australia and Papua New Guinea. Nobody fully understands yet how genetic material from that region ended up in the Americas so many thousands of years ago, but the evidence proves that early human migration was far messier and far more complex than a simple straight line moving out of Africa. European populations hold similar surprises. Ancient DNA pulled from old European skeletons revealed that modern Europeans are not direct descendants of the very first hunter-gatherers who originally settled the continent. Those early groups were largely replaced by incoming farming populations that arrived from Anatolia around 9,000 years ago. Those farming groups were then partially replaced again by herding populations arriving from the eastern steppes roughly 5,000 years ago. Modern Europeans are essentially a blend of at least 3 separate waves of population movement, none of whom ever thought of themselves as European, because the very idea of Europe as an identity didn't exist yet. East Asian genetic history tells an equally complicated story. The Han Chinese population, often treated as one single uniform racial group, actually represents a long-term blend of northern and southern populations that gradually merged together over thousands of years of migration, trade, and political unification. The level of genetic diversity found within China alone rivals the genetic diversity found across the entire continent of Europe. Treating over 1 billion people as a single uniform race completely ignores the enormous variation hiding just beneath the surface. When researchers compared DNA samples from across the globe, it dismantled nearly every scientific argument that had ever been used to support the idea of racial superiority or racial separation. It proved that human genetic variation flows continuously, without any hard boundaries separating one group from another. It showed that populations blend gradually into one another, without clean dividing lines. It confirmed that the genetic differences found within any single racial group are actually larger, on average, than the genetic differences found between different groups. Most importantly, it backed up something anthropologists and biologists have been saying for decades. Race is a social construct, not a biological fact. The categories humans invented to divide ourselves simply do not match the real patterns found in our DNA. We created race as a tool to justify social hierarchies, and then convinced ourselves those hierarchies reflected some kind of natural biological truth. The genetic evidence proves that was never the case. This does not mean the effects of racism are somehow not real. Social categories built around race have shaped access to resources, opportunity, and power for centuries, and continue to shape people's lives today. The lived experiences of people placed into different racial categories remain vastly different from one another, even though the biological basis for those categories does not exist. Understanding that race isn't rooted in genetics doesn't erase the very real social and economic consequences that racism has caused and continues to cause. But it does take away any excuse to hide behind claims of natural differences or so-called biological destiny. There is no genetic explanation for why certain groups hold more power than others. There's no DNA-based justification for unequal access to resources. The inequalities we see in wealth, health, education, and opportunity come from historical and ongoing social systems, not from any unavoidable genetic difference between groups of people. The scientists who compared DNA samples from every corner of the Earth handed us a powerful tool, one capable of tearing down centuries of false, pseudoscientific thinking about race. They proved that underneath our surface-level differences, human beings are remarkably alike. They revealed that human diversity is a beautiful, ongoing story of adaptation and change, not a ladder ranking some people above others. They confirmed that every person on this planet belongs to one connected human family, sharing a common history and hopefully a shared future. This discovery didn't just surprise the scientific world, it reshaped our entire understanding of what it truly means to be human, and it gave us solid evidence to finally leave behind the harmful myth of biological race, once and for all. What we choose to do with that knowledge now is entirely up to us.